Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. On behalf of the National Transit Institute, I welcome you and thank you for participating today. The National Transit Institute develops, promotes, and delivers training and education programs for the public transit industry in the United States. Today's webinar is National Transit Database 2022 Annual NTD Reporting Clarifications. Please note this webinar will not extend past 60 minutes and will end at 3 p.m. Eastern. And we are very pleased to have as our presenters today Matt Oliver, Matt Bonzik, and Joe Eldridge. Matt Oliver joined the NTD team in 2008. He holds an MA and BA from the University of Virginia and currently serves as the operations manager for the NTD validation team. Matt Bonzik has been with the NTD team since 2012 and serves as the quality assurance lead for the program. He graduated from the University of North Carolina with an MS in mathematics. And Joe Eldridge manages the NTD Operations Center. He has over 12 years of experience in the public transit industry and holds a BS in Systems Engineering from the University of Virginia. During today's presentation, you can ask a question at any time by typing it in the Q&A box. If you do not see the box, you can enable it by clicking on the Q&A box on the Zoom controls, which are most likely at the bottom of your screen. If you have not already printed out a copy of the updated presentation that was emailed to you a little earlier today, I will be pasting the link in the chat box in just a bit. I will now turn the presentation over to Matt Oliver. Matt?
Great, thank you very much, Cylindra. Okay, thank you. And we'd like to welcome all of you to the 2022 Report Year Changes and Clarifications webinar. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us in learning about the updates and changes associated with the 2022 NTD report year. Please take note of this disclaimer. The contents of this document do not have the force and effect of law and are not meant to bind the public in any way. Grantees and subgrantees should refer to FTA statutes and regulations for applicable National Transit Database requirements. Furthermore, any changes mentioned in this document are subject to change and will not take effect until the NTD report year opens. The goal of this webinar is to identify the updates to the annual NTD reporting requirements for all reporter types for the 2022 report year. This webinar will be broken out into three sections: a review of the clarifications related to COVID-19's impact of NTD data collection and how FTA plans to use the NTD data, a review of the changes for report year 2022 and the reporting system, which includes planned enhancements, the FFA 10 data, and how to update the FFA 10 data, and finally, a review of the updates to the general program. This slide identifies contact information you should use when you are unable to contact your assigned NTD analyst or if you're having technical issues with the reporting system. The NTD Help Desk is manned by an NTD analyst Monday through Friday between the hours of 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. This help desk service should be used as a resource to help with questions regarding the following: how to report your NTD data, questions or clarifications regarding NTD policy, or questions and clarifications regarding reporting requirements. One important change to call attention to is that the 188 NTD Help Desk number has now been retired. And please note, you should only rely on the NTD Help Desk if you are unable to reach your assigned NTD analyst. The FTA Application Help Desk services are available 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Monday through Friday. The FTA Application Help Desk should be used as a resource to help with questions regarding requests across all FTA-specific applications and systems. Reasons to contact the FTA Application Help Desk include login issues, system errors or bugs, or technical-related assistance due to performance issues in the system. As mentioned earlier by Cylindria, today's presenters will be Joseph Eldridge, Matt Bonzik, and myself, Matt Oliver. If you have any questions that come up after the webinar, please feel free to reach out to one presenter or all of us, and we'll be more than happy to assist in providing you with direction or clarification as needed. This slide identifies FTA's program contacts. Tom Coleman is the NTD manager, or NTD program manager for the Office of Budget and Policy, and John Georges is the Director of Strategic Planning and Analysis for the Office of Budget and Policy. We will now take a look at some important dates and deadlines associated with NTD reporting. The target launch for annual reporting is set for mid to late September 2022. The table presented here represents some important dates based on your agency's fiscal year end date. If your fiscal year end date is June 30th, your annual report due date is October 31st. If your fiscal year end date is September 30th, your annual report due date is January 31st. And finally, if your fiscal year end date is December 31st, your annual report due date is April 30th. Please note, if you think your agency will require a waiver, special requests, etc., you must file that request 60 days prior to the annual report due date. For our NTD analysts to close out the NTD database, we have set specific deadlines for the following: the last date to submit a revision to your report, and a specific date in which we hope to close each reporting period. For example, if your fiscal year end date is June 30th, your last day to submit a revision is March 1st, and all October NTD reports should be closed by March 15th. If your fiscal year end date is September 30th, your last day to submit revisions is May 1st, and all January NTD reports should be closed by May 15th. And finally, if your fiscal year end date is December 31st, your last day to submit revisions is July 2nd, and all April NTD reports should be closed by July 15th. We'll now move on to review several reference materials that are designed to help you with your understanding and reporting of NTD data. The 5 links provide information or resources that are designed to help the NTD reporters do the following: understand reporting requirements, provide tools and guides to help navigate with NTD reporting policy, and to provide location of past NTD data. The first link, titled NTD Program Website, is where you can find anything from transit agency profiles, NTD data reports, policy manuals, dates and times for training opportunities, PDF versions of reporting forms, and links to the NTD platform. The second link, titled NTD Reporting FAQ, is a very helpful resource that we update annually based on questions encountered throughout the reporting process. This is a fantastic resource that covers common questions such as resetting passwords, viewing or printing prior year's reports, importing, exporting data, or even applying for extension requests. The third link, 2022 Reporting Policy Manuals, explains the reporting requirements and how to report based on different reporting types. These manuals include NTD Reporting Policy Manuals, Reduced Reporting Policy Manuals, Safety and Security Policy Manuals, and COVID-19 and NTD Reporting Guides. Please note, the 2022 NTD Reporting Policy Manual and the 2022 Reduced Reporting Policy Manual will be published on the FTA Manuals page in September. The 2022 Reporting Policy Manual link also provides guidance regarding the NTD Uniform System of Accounts, Transit Asset Management Guidebooks, and the NTD Glossary. The fourth link, titled The Guide, NTD Reporting and COVID-19, is a reference document to help your agency meet the NTD reporting requirements during this national health emergency. This document provides guidance on the following key data collection and reporting issues: understanding how NTD data will be used for funding, collecting service consumed data, reporting changes in service supplied, reporting expenses related to COVID-19, reporting employee data, and finally, reporting condition assessments. And finally, the FAQ from FTA grantees regarding COVID-19 link is a great resource that is designed to provide clarity regarding how COVID-19 preparations impact certain FTA requirements. And with that being said, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Matt Bonzik, who will talk about the reporting guidance during the COVID-19 public health emergency.
Thank you, Matt. The first thing I'd like to review is FTA's policy on sampling frequency for passenger miles traveled data. So this applies only to full reporters. This is not new. This is an existing policy that's been in place for many years, but we thought it would be useful just to review the policy so that everyone understands it. So to start, if you do not have a 100% count of unlinked passenger trips that's available and reliable, then you're required to sample annually. Your sample would cover both UPT and passenger miles traveled, PMT. If you're operating purchase transportation service, including transportation network companies and taxi service, those services are allowed to sample triennially. Also, if your primary UZA is under 500,000 population, you can sample triennially. And finally, if your total vehicles operated in maximum service across all directly operated modes is under 100, then you can sample triennially. But if none of those apply, then you're required to sample annually. So basically, large agencies in large UZAs operating DO service are required to sample annually. So next, let's talk about sampling for service consumed data during COVID. Next slide, please. Thank you. So FTA made a special rule in 2020. 2020 ordinarily would have been a mandatory sampling year for triennial samplers, but because the COVID pandemic began during 2020 as a measure to help agencies protect the health of their employees, FTA canceled the 2020 mandatory year and told triennial samplers that they can continue to use the 2017, or if you have it, 2018 or 2019 sample in order to report passenger miles traveled. 2022 is also not a mandatory sampling year. So if you used your 2017, 18, or 19 sample to estimate passenger miles last year, then you can do that for 2022 as well. The next mandatory year is 2023. So that one is in effect. It's not being canceled due to COVID. So that means that you should plan to sample for 2023. In fact, many of you, your fiscal year 2023 will have started in July 1st. So your sampling should be underway. If it's not, or if you anticipate some problems with the sample, I encourage you to reach out to your NTD analyst, and they can help you figure out how to best meet the requirement and whether you need any waivers or anything like that. If you have an annual sampling requirement, then hopefully you can complete that requirement for 2023. But again, if not, you should contact your analyst and they'll help you figure out a way forward. So next, let's talk about service applicability. So what services are you allowed to report and should you report to the NTD? First of all, I know some agencies have operated emergency services, often in coordination with medical centers or emergency management agencies. Typically, those would not meet the definition of public transportation, which is required to be regular and continuing. Also, I know a lot of agencies have received 5307 or 5311 funds to support meal delivery, such as Meals on Wheels. Even though that is FTA funding, public transportation by definition is passenger service, passenger transportation. So meal delivery is not reportable to the NTD, even if it was funded with 5307 or 5311 funds. If you have a specific service that you think is sort of in a gray area in terms of applicability or reportability, I would encourage you to talk to your analyst about that. I think this venue is probably not the best one to get into details and specifics, but please do contact your analyst and they'll help you determine whether you should report the service or not. So next, let's talk about measures that agencies have taken to facilitate social distancing in their service. So one thing a lot of agencies have done is limit their ride sharing, especially for demand response or van pool services. They may have put a cap on the number of passengers allowed per vehicle in order to allow passengers to distance themselves. Agencies that are doing that temporarily as a public health measure should continue to report that service, even though the ride sharing may be suspended or limited, as long as that service does still meet the rest of the definition of public transportation. Let's talk about double-heading vehicles. So the idea here is that many agencies wanted to limit the capacity of their vehicles in order to allow passengers to distance themselves. And there are a few different ways to do that. One way you can do that is by double heading. Double heading basically means that you have two buses operating in tandem, running the same route, same schedule. And once the first bus reaches its maximum capacity, the second bus will open its doors and passengers will start getting directed to that second bus instead. And so that will enable agencies to keep up their level of service while keeping the passengers at a greater distance from each other. So if you're double heading vehicles, you should report the miles and hours that those vehicles spend en route service in the NTD on both your monthly and annual reports. So those miles do count as revenue service. Even if the second vehicle doesn't actually open its doors until partway through the route, the entire time that it's on that route is considered revenue service. Another approach that some agencies have is to use a floating vehicle, which basically means you have a vehicle at some standby location, not open to passengers, but just waiting to see if it's needed. And if it is needed because the vehicle reaches its capacity, or perhaps because the vehicle breaks down, then that vehicle gets dispatched. So for a floater vehicle, if that vehicle does get dispatched, then once it's in service, you should report miles and hours as revenue service. But if the vehicle never ends up being needed, if it just stays at the standby location and doesn't get dispatched into a route, then you should not report those miles and hours that it spends traveling to and from the standby location. So next, let's talk about expenses and funding. So one thing that has been a reporting issue in the past couple of years is what we call extraordinary and special items. And so these are expenses and revenues that basically are spent or received in response to a disaster situation. And so for the past couple of years, many agencies have reported COVID-related expenses as extraordinary and special items. The guidance has changed for report year 2022. For this year, FTA's direction is that you should not report COVID-related expenses as extraordinary and special. Instead, you should report them as normal operating expenses on your F30 form. On the form R10, you report employee work hours, and those should also be reported as normal, whether the employees are working on COVID-related projects or not. There have been three major relief bills that have been passed and signed into law. Those are CARES, CRISA, and ARP. And so these are sources of funds that you will report on the F10 or RR20 if you receive them. We just want to call these out to make sure that agencies understand they're reported separately from normal FTA funds. So for example, on your F10 form, if you look at the 5307 section, you'll see a line for normal 5307 funds. And then below that, you'll see CARES 5307, CRISA 5307, ARP 5307. So please, when you're reporting your FTA revenues, double check to see which ones are normal or CARES, CRISA, or ARP, and just make sure that you report them in the appropriate line. Do not report these funds as extraordinary and special. So now I'm going to turn this over to Joe Eldridge. He's going to discuss changes to the NTD reporting system for the upcoming report year. Joe?
All right, thank you very much, Matt. So in the last year, FTA released several design improvements to the NTD reporting application. And in case you don't have the link to that site, it's https://faces.fta.dot.gov. That's the portal you'll use to access the online reporting system. The NTD generally releases minor enhancements every 2 weeks to the system. You can find out more about that by clicking the help page on the top right of the home landing site for the NTD. Again, if you don't have that link and or don't know how to access the online reporting system, I would recommend contacting NTD help at dot.gov, or if you know your assigned analyst, contact them as well. We want to make sure everyone has access and is comfortable with the requirements before they start the process of compiling data. So this is a notice that at least 2 planned design improvements that affect annual 2022 reporting will go into place sometime within this report year. For the background on the first change, NTD reporters operating in urban areas, or urban reporters, must report the total miles each vehicle fleet was driven during the fiscal year, or the total miles on active vehicles, as it's called on Form A30. In addition, those same operators must report the average lifetime miles on their vehicle fleets at the end of the fiscal year, which is the average mileage since the date of manufacture on active vehicles at each fiscal year end. So since the latter value, average lifetime miles, can be calculated using the total miles on active vehicles you report and the average lifetime miles value from the prior year, FTA is releasing a function to auto-calculate average lifetime miles on Form A30. FTA recognizes that this is an imperfect solution as it relies on the previous year's average to compute, which may need to be re-examined each year. So FTA will also allow agencies to make corrections or override the calculated value if necessary. This functionality will be released later this calendar year. We're hoping in time for the reporting deadline in October. FTA is also adding a feature on the A35 and A15 forms to eliminate the need to perpetually save these forms with each report year if they contain no data. This only applies if your agency has no reporting responsibility for these types of assets. Those are the service vehicle inventory, that's the A35, and the facilities inventory, that's A15. More information on those requirements can be found in the most recent NTD reporting manual. Okay, so we will now discuss the anticipated release of the 2020 decennial census geographic area data and the impact on 2022 annual reports. So for some background, federal law requires FTA to use the most recent decennial census data in its formula funding apportionments. And to review, the NTD is the mechanism FTA uses to collect the data needed for the service-based formula factors. For example, PMT, operating expenses, VRM are a few data points that are used in the 5307 formula. The same federal law also indicates the term urbanized areas, which is in the context of NTD reporting, the areas served by your transit operations, encompass a population of not less than 50,000 people that has been defined and designated in the most recent decennial census as an urbanized area. So importantly for this year, and probably familiar to those of you who are involved in planning for MPOs, especially, the Census Bureau has retired the term urban clusters, which used to mean an urbanized area between 2,500 and 50,000 people, and now includes in its definition of urban area a threshold of at least 2,000 housing units or over 5,000 people. Other changes to how the urban areas are established can be found in the Census Bureau's final notice on this, which is linked from the third bullet. And I'm aware we're having some problems with links, but Cylindria says stay tuned on that. Hopefully we'll, by the end of the presentation, have some clarity on how you can access those. But moving forward, urban areas, according to the Census Bureau, and urbanized areas that you see listed on the B10 form in the NTD will not be the same list because of that threshold change. And so in NTD, we'll continue to use the threshold of 50,000 or more to define an urban area. So in other words, it'll be a subset of the Census Bureau's or urban areas. So FTA will continue to call non-urbanized areas, meaning areas with less than 50,000 people. We'll refer to those in guidance as rural areas for the sake of NTD reporting. So next, we're going to talk about the release schedule for this data. So just to quickly review, around December 2022, the Census Bureau will release the new list of urban areas. And that will be the data source we use in NTD for the B10 form to make that update. Around that time, they will also release urban area maps and shape files, which may be important for many of you who are performing that data allocation task on the FFA 10. We'll talk more about in a minute. In other words, a lot of us listening here care about the boundaries because we're using actual data methods to allocate across urban areas or urban and rural areas on the federal funding allocation form. Related, the NTD does not anticipate updates to our SERV rules, which provide the rules for allocating data on this form based on where your trips end, how many areas are crossed, funding sources. So you can consult the 2021 manual, which is the most recent published, to learn a little bit more about those SERV rules, which will be repeated in the 2022 manual. And please continue to use consistent allocation methods or explain any changes you're using in the methodology for the upcoming year. For those of you who perform this task, there are a few other resources listed on this slide. TigerWeb is one of them. That's a great visualization tool, which is a mapping service that you don't have to download data or a GIS software to visualize. So when the urban areas are updated, TigerWeb will follow. I will also have a map of those areas. So getting to the point, the census impact on NTD reporting and the FFA 10 form is what we're going to talk about now. So we're fairly confident that this data, next slide, Matt, will be available in December or around then. So there's no point in requiring an allocation on the FFA 10 form in advance of that when we're going to have to update the names of urbanized areas, the geographic area that those represent will change. We realize that many operators here only operate in a single urban area and will probably continue to do so even after this data is released. But again, we don't know officially what those UZAs will be until all the rules the Census Bureau has established in its notice are applied. So we have to wait until that's finished to perform the allocation. What this means for us, you will not see the FFA 10 form in your NTD report when the forms are launched for this year. You'll be able to complete the rest of your annual reporting forms as normal. You'll be able to submit your report without the FFA 10 filled out, and you do not need to make any changes to list of urban areas to reflect your service changes yet, because you'll need to complete that part in December or shortly thereafter, whenever the Census Bureau releases the updated urban areas. The NTD program is currently testing this just to make sure reporting can continue smoothly. We're going to provide a little bit more detail coming up. So when this happens, this is what the task will look like. So actually filing your FFA 10 upon census area release. Matt, if you could go to the next slide, please. Because not everyone in the NTD reports at the same time, and there's also still a little bit of uncertainty in that schedule that I just referenced, FTA is developing a modular approach. So in the reporting system, you'll see a task. There's a tab called tasks. You'll see a task to complete your census area allocation that you normally would on the FFA 10. Clicking on this task is going to guide you through a series of steps that will look a lot like updating the B10 and FFA 10 forms as you normally would when you first submit your report. But again, that's not going to come till later. You'll need to update demographic areas as applicable and complete the allocation based on the 2020 census areas. State DOT reports, for those of you who are reporting on behalf of subrecipients, or you may be a subrecipient of the 5311 program, state DOTs will have their reports held open for the purpose of identifying rural reporters that now operate in urbanized areas, and completing the allocation as applicable for any of those affected agencies. So this is, for many of us, new functionality. The last decennial census handled this slightly differently because it was at a much different time of year. It was handled over the summer in between report years. So FTA is also committing to providing a lot more information in 2 more upcoming webinars. So there are going to, in the next slide, please, be more opportunities for reviewing the impact of this. In the fall, October 18th and 20th, for rural and urban operators respectively, we'll have 1 webinar with more step-by-step instructions on how this is going to be done, also hosted by NTI. So we're strongly encouraging participation there. Also strongly encouraging all of you to visit the second page listed for more information and links to other pages within FTA's program website, including a presentation on the census and its relation to FTA formula programs by the Budget and Policy Office at the CTAA Expo this year. All right. Finally, there's some routine program updates to be aware of. The first one is in April 2022, which for some of you was after the 2021 report year. For others, it was in the middle of the last reporting cycle. There was a federal mandate to move away from using the Dun and Bradstreet number, or DUNS, to uniquely identify organizations. And of course, that applied to the NTD as well. The unique entity ID is now used instead to identify specific commercial nonprofit or government entities. And you'll find that in sam.gov if you're registered there. While not every NTD ID and unique entity ID, or UE ID, will be one-to-one, it's still a very important data point because it provides FTA with information about your organization. So the NTD actually queries information from sam.gov using that unique ID if you provide it. This helps keep the physical address for your agency updated on the identification form, or the P10. So please make sure that that number is current on your P10 form. All right. Please also note, if you're using automatic passenger counters to report service data, this is a mandatory year upcoming in 2022 to recertify those passenger counters. Most current policy manual, again, that's the published 2021 manual, will have all the details you need to know about the APC certification process and the benchmarking plan and what that requires. FTA does not anticipate any changes to the requirements that are published there. The plan is going to contain detailed information about your sampling procedures, trips flagged and rejected from your APCs, and descriptions of differences between the APC data generated and manually collected interstop distances if you're comparing for the sake of collecting passenger miles traveled, or PMT. The objective of the plan is to compare that data with processed APC data and demonstrate that they're equivalent or approximately equivalent, that differences are justifiable. And repeating this every 3 years is a way to make sure the APCs are still performing as they were when you last certified them. So that was 2019 or later. Transit agencies applying to use APC data must submit the benchmarking plan to FTA for approval. In this case, you can submit again to your assigned NTD validation analyst. There's more detail on the requirement listed in the last bullet here, which is the presentations and webinars page on the NTD program site. All right. Finally, 2022 also begins a new 4-year transit asset management cycle, or TAM cycle. For the NTD, this is important because the asset inventory data collection, which lives within the asset inventory module, includes your facility inventory, service vehicle inventory, revenue vehicle inventory, and transit way mileage, or track miles for those of you operating rail modes. TAM narrative reports are also submitted through the A90 form. And this year, 25% of facilities must have an updated condition assessment. So the NTD is still requiring that you repeat those 25% intervals, 25% once every year, building up over the 4 years to 100% of updated condition assessments. So, for example, if your agency has capital replacement responsibility for 8 administrative facilities or parking facilities, at least 2 of those should have an updated condition assessment from 2022 when you report this year. The refresh of this cycle also means that group plan sponsors will be asked to confirm your group plan participants. State DOTs and other plan sponsors are going to receive an email from your analyst confirming the list of your plan participants for whom you are reporting and filling out performance targets on Form A90. The NTD program definitely appreciates your commitment to providing this information, and also want to congratulate the industry on a successful first 4 years of reporting and staying in line with this requirement. All right, well, that concludes the substance of our presentation. Our contact information is repeated here. We really appreciate your participation today. If you did not get your question answered today, please contact us at one of these numbers. You should also have the contact information for us at the beginning of the slides. We really encourage you to use that in advance of the report here to get the questions answered so we can hit the ground running in mid-September when the application launches. I will now hand it back to Cylindria.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. Just want to thank you for your patience and for participating in today's webinar. Of course, a special thank you to Joe Eldridge, Matt Oliver, and Matt Bonzik for their very informative presentation. Just a reminder, you will be receiving an invitation to fill out an evaluation for this event. And within that email, we'll also attach those links again from the presentation. We always appreciate your feedback. We appreciate you for attending once again. Thank you, and be well, everyone.